Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about leaky gut. It's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot. So some people think it's the cause of everything, and others think that it's not even real. And neither of those perspectives are really helpful. There's actually a normal process behind this that's supposed to happen. So that's what I'm going to break down today. What's supposed to happen, what goes wrong, and how that connects to things like food sensitivities, brain fog, skin issues, all those things. So before I get into the mechanism, it helps to look at how this actually shows up. So think about some of the most common symptoms people typically complain about. We got bloating, we got joint pain, brain fog, migraines, skin flare-ups. And I actually had three of those. I had the bloating, the joint pain, the skin flares. So it can be pretty significant. And often they seem unrelated, and we blame it on the weather, the poor sleep, the stress, maybe a stomach bug, something bad we ate. And what I want you to consider is that those aren't really random. Often there's a common starting point. Something is allowing more through the gut lining than there should be allowed to go through. And then once that happens, the immune system starts reacting. And over time, those reactions can show up in different ways. That's why one person ends up with food sensitivities while another one has skin issues, and a third one might just only have some headaches here and there. So there are different symptoms, but they all stem from a similar root cause. Now, most people have heard that term leaky gut at some point. I expect that you have as well. And the problem is that what they've heard is typically incomplete. The common assumption is that there's something wrong with the gut, so you just need to fix it. And that usually turns into cutting out foods, taking supplements, maybe something you saw on Instagram or something that popped up in your emails, the next hyped thing, and just a way to try to patch things up. And sometimes that actually helps a little. But most of the time, it really doesn't last. It doesn't give lasting relief because the actual issue is something completely different. Now, the gut is supposed to be permeable, meaning things are supposed to pass through. That's how nutrients actually get absorbed. And what matters here is actually control. The lining is designed to allow certain things through while it's supposed to keep other things out. And when that regulation is off, and that's typically when problems start. And now it's not just nutrients getting through, it's things the immune system doesn't recognize as safe. And that's where reactions can begin. And so to understand this better, it helps to look at what the gut is actually designed to do. And there's a real simple way to think about how the gut is supposed to work. You can think of it like the strainer that you see on the screen. The liquid passes through, and that's what you want. But the larger particles, the tea leaves or the coffee grounds, you can take your pick, those stay behind. And that's the separation that's supposed to help at the gut lining. So it works in a very similar way to the strainer. Nutrients are meant to pass through, but larger particles, things that aren't fully broken down, things your immune system would react to, those are supposed to stay in the intestinal lumen, inside your intestines. And that process is tightly controlled. And when it's working properly, you get absorption without any kind of reactions. And when that control is lost, then that separation starts to break down. And once that separation breaks down, things start getting through that shouldn't. So what controls that separations are structures, they're called tight junctions. And you can see them here, these little red equal signs. Those are the tight junctions. They act like little gatekeepers between the cells or between the cells that are lining the gut. And you got to understand that lining in the gut is only one cell layer thick. There's no pyramidal cells. There's only a single layer. And so when they're working properly and they open and close as needed, so they can let nutrients pass through while keeping larger particles out. And that's how it's supposed to function. That's what's normal. And that is controlled permeability. And there's a signaling molecule involved here that's called zonulin. And zonulin helps regulate how open or how close those junctions are. And again, it's not inherently bad if they open. The problem is when that regulation is off, when there's inflammation in the gut lumen. And now those junctions stay more open than they actually should. And the barrier becomes too permissive. And that's when things start to get through that we were never meant to enter the bloodstream, getting circulated all throughout the body. And this isn't really just structural, it's also a functional issue. That signal to open and close isn't being controlled the way it should be. So once that barrier is more open than it should be, the question becomes what's actually getting through? And so one category is undigested food particles. If proteins aren't fully broken down, those larger fragments can pass through the gut lining because they cause damage there. The immune system doesn't recognize those as safe, and that's where that reactivity can actually begin. Another category is bacterial fragments. There's parts of bacteria, especially like lipopolysaccharides, that can cross into the circulation. And these lipopolysaccharides, or LPS for short, they're highly inflammatory. The body reacts quickly to those. That's actually part of the process of sepsis. So they can create a significant amount of inflammation if they get into the bloodstream. And then, of course, there's toxins, medications, different things like that, things that should stay in the gut and be eliminated with bowel movements. They now have a pathway into the body. And at that point, the issue is no longer just digestion. Now the immune system is involved. Your gut is no longer just absorbing nutrients, it's exposing your immune system. And once the immune system is exposed to those things repeatedly, well, then it starts responding. And so that's really what the immune system is supposed to do. That's its job. It's constantly scanning for anything that doesn't belong. So when it sees undigested food particles or bacterial fragments or toxins, it treats them as foreign. It creates a response. And that response, of course, can include inflammation, antibody production, and also increased sensitivity. A very common one is gluten sensitivity. When gluten gets into or leaves the gut lumen and gets into the bloodstream, then the body will start, in some people, will start to react to that. And that creates the autoimmunity to, for example, the thyroid. So at first, that response could be really subtle where you don't hardly even notice. But with, repeated exposures, then the system becomes more reactive. And now it's not just responding, it's actually anticipating, scanning, being vigilant, hypervigilant to see if there's anything that's going to come in. And that's often where food sensitivities come from. It's not because the food itself is the problem, but because the immune system is on edge, it's been exposed to it repeatedly in a way that it wasn't designed to handle. It's just hypervigilant, and now it starts to react at the very first sight of it. So none of this is random. It's reacting based on exposure, and that's where this starts to show up in many different ways that people then actually notice. And when you start to notice something, then you actually realize that there's something off. But for many of us in our current environment, in our very fast-paced lifestyles, we've forgotten how to actually listen to our bodies, how to pay attention to what they're telling us. But anyway, often it shows up as a pattern of symptoms. Food sensitivities are just one of the most common ones. Foods that used to be fine suddenly start to cause reactions like gas or bloating. Brain fog is another one, that difficulty concentrating, maybe feeling mentally slow, sometimes headaches or migraines. And of course, the skin can also be affected. That's where, psoriasis is a common issue that comes from that leaky gut or that hyperpermeable gut. So you can have rashes and irritations and flare-ups that don't seem to have a really clear cause. They just seem to be happening randomly, even eczema. And in some cases, this process can also contribute to autoimmune patterns. I'm not going to go into too deep into that here because that's really part of the bigger picture. But what really matters is this. These symptoms don't usually show up in isolation. They tend to cluster, and when they do, there's often something upstream that's driving them. And the majority of people try to manage these, one at a time. Take some Tylenol for the headache, take some ibuprofen for the joint pain, get some cortisone cream for the eczema or the rash. And so the next question really becomes, or should become, what actually causes this to happen in the first place? And of course, you hear me talk about this all the time. Stress is our biggest enemy in this realm. We need a little bit of stress in our life just to get resilience in our bodies, kind of like if you would train for a marathon. Of course, you're going to stress your body a little bit so that you can get that strength build up, the cardiovascular response in order to be able to run a marathon. But what I'm talking about here is this chronic, ongoing, never-ending, constant stress. When cortisol stays elevated over time like this, it changes how the gut lining functions. So it can affect those tight junctions that I mentioned earlier. It can signal them to stay more open than they should be. And at the same time, it also can impact digestion. We've talked about this before, how it can suppress stomach acid and enzyme output and motility. And all of that can be affected while you're chronically stressed. And so now you have two things happening. Food isn't being broken down as well. And then also the barrier is more open. And that's just not a good combination. It leads to inflammation in the gut lining, which will cause more damage to the gut lining and cause more tight junctions to open until it can become really severe. And so more particles are getting through, and the immune system is exposed more often. And so it's just there's a downward spiral at that point. Of course, there's also an impact on the blood flow when you're stressed. Under stress, the body prioritizes survival, and blood flow will shift away from digestion and towards the muscles and the brain to ensure your survival. And that means the gut lining is then not getting the same level of support. The blood is not being circulated as much to the gut. And so it's lacking oxygen, it's lacking nutrients, it's lacking the ability to get rid of waste. So over time, that also will affect how healthy your gut lining is. So this is why stress shows up in digestion so often. It's not just a feeling, it's changing how your body functions. And then, of course, we have processed foods that come into play here as well. Ingredients that the body doesn't handle well, the repeated exposure to them, which also leads to poor digestion. All of that will add up over time. And then alcohol is another issue. It directly affects the gut lining. Even some moderate intake can have an impact if it's a moderate intake that happens consistently. And then we have medications that are a big one that often gets overlooked. NSAIDs, antibiotics. They can disrupt that lining and the gut environment. And then last, we have infections, whether it's bacterial infection or viral or even past infections, they can change how that gut barrier functions. And this is because those infections can affect the gut microbiome, and it plays an integral part in hormone production, hormone metabolism, also production of the mucus layer in the gut. So the bacterial balance is really vital to overall health. So when you think about all of those things, it's really a cumulative effect that all these different stress points on the body indicate. They add on top of each other. It's like the stress bucket, I think I mentioned before, each one adds another drop into the bucket, and then at some point it will run over, and that's when you start to have symptoms. So when you combine all those triggers, that is what it starts to look like. And so for a lot of people, you're putting in the effort and you're trying different things. You change your diet, you're adding some supplements, maybe you're avoiding some foods, and maybe you feel a little bit little bit better for a while. But then you end up right back where you started. Kind of like Sisyphus pushing that ball up the hill. The same symptoms, the same frustrations. So maybe you try some new supplements. Maybe you cut out some more foods, until you get down where you only tolerate 5 foods, and the body will have a hard time function with that. But that cycle can happen over and over and over again when the only thing we focus on is managing the symptoms. So, obviously removing some foods can reduce symptoms, and adding some supplements can support things for a time. But if those underlying drivers are still there, the stress, the poor digestion, those ongoing triggers, nothing really changes for the long term. So it turns into this constant cycle of trying and adjusting and falling back down and then trying something else, and without actually making any progress or moving forward. And that's what keeps people stuck, like Sisyphus. And so this is where we want to shift our focus. We don't want to just manage symptoms, but actually address the drivers. So first it is remove those drivers. If the same things that are disrupting the barrier are still happening every day, nothing else is going to stick. If you keep doing what you've been doing, you're going to keep getting what you've been getting. And so that's the stress, the diet, the alcohol, the medications. Those have to be looked at honestly. And then second, of course, is support the barrier itself. The gut lining has an ability to repair itself. It turns over every 3 to 5 days. But it needs that right environment to do that. So if you continue to eat those processed foods or have a very stressful life, you're not going to get this healthy gut lining, from as it turns over every 3 to 5 days, because the stressors are still there. So that's not just taking one supplement, it's the overall conditions that the body lives in. Because, if the food isn't being broken down properly, of course, then it creates that inflammation. So we want to support digestion. When the food is not broken down properly, you're increasing the load on the body. More undigested particles, more exposure, and then, of course, more reactions. And then the nervous system, of course, is really, really important. If the body is constantly in this fight or flight mode, it's not going to prioritize digestion or repair. And that has to be addressed as part of that process. So it's not just one thing. All these things have to kind of happen in combination. And then that's what actually will move the needle for people. And this is where testing can be really helpful. There's different ways to figure out which foods are triggering. Of course, you all know what's stressing you out. You don't typically need help figuring that part out. But you could do a journal, you could do a food diary, keep track of what you're eating and then what kind of symptoms you're having and if there's a correlation or connection between them. But this can be like a really lengthy process, and it can be confusing because sometimes these reactions don't happen right away. They're not like allergies. They can happen 2 to 3 days later. So something you ate 3 days ago could give you a headache today. So that's where these food sensitivity tests and other tests can be really helpful because they eliminate that guessing part. So we have the KBMO fit test or the MRT that can give us insight on in what foods your body is actually reacting to. And we can test the zonulin. If you remember, it's a peptide that regulates how often and how far those junctions open. So we can test for that and see if there's an elevation there. We have a GI map test or other stool tests that can look at the gut environment so we can see what the bacterial balance is, if there's any pathogens, and even how well digestion is working. So each of these can give us a different piece of the picture. And not everyone needs this, but when used appropriately, they can really help narrow things down and speed up the process of feeling better. So this is not a way to fix things, but it's really to help stop the guessing. So, I always say test, don't guess. So I hope that understanding what's happening at the gut level explains a lot of the symptoms that maybe don't seem to be connected at first. Now, for some of you, just recognizing that piece will change maybe how you look at things. And that can be just really helpful in giving you a different perspective. So with that, I invite you to leave your questions or leave any kind of comments. I'll be happy to answer them or reply back. And then have a look out and see what, notice what's going on with your body and pay some attention to it and give it some love. And with that, I will see you next time. Yeah, stop the recording.